Let's start by what ChatGPT and large language models are. We need to ground it in that. They fundamentally are massive ways of doing text prediction. So they're able to mimic human speech in a way which is very convincing, for lack of a better word. That is not the same as them doing any kind of reasoning. From universities to tech companies to philanthropies to government, the problems that we face as a world together, from the climate crisis to pandemics, are huge problems, complex, systemic, interconnected. What we need to help solve them are...
Hey folks, how are we doing this week? Well, these days for me, it feels like everywhere I turn, there's an AI solution being pitched at me. And yet, what's often underestimated or not talked about is the way that these models are built and, importantly, what fuels them, the data. And so when I met with Danil Mikhailov last year, I was keen to have him on the show to break down for our funder and founder community the groundbreaking work that DataDotOrg is doing. Now, the quick and dirty, DataDotOrg is a collaboration between MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Rockefeller Foundation, a platform for partnerships to build the field of data science for social impacts. But wait a minute, what does that mean? What does it mean to do data for good? Is the digital divide widening, and what can we as investors actually do about it? Well, this week's episode takes a fascinating tangent. From combating climate change to promoting equitable access to education and healthcare, Danil and his team at DataDotOrg are catalyzing positive change through data-driven solutions, and this convo is not to be missed.
This was the days before the internet, before the World Wide Web. I felt like there was not enough human in computer science. It was all ones and zeros. So I retrained as an anthropologist. So I did my master's degree in anthropology, studying Chinese traditional culture. Spent about 7-8 years doing field work in China, studying various traditional practices, culture, religion, calligraphy, martial arts, music. Interesting time when China was opening up in the early 2000s. And then as I did it, I got back into tech almost accidentally because I needed a way to publish kind of the amazing material I was gathering with friends. At that point, I began to see the human in tech, which I was missing earlier. So the web, the internet really changed it for me. I could see how you could interact with audiences. I could see how rich content could be video content. It was just the early days of YouTube being launched. Then on, I've spent about 20 years of my career working in that intersection of technology and culture.
So one of your last stints, I suppose, that really brought you to the work of Data.org is that with Welcome Data Labs that you founded. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, the last chapter of this journey in bringing you to really merging impact, human centricity in data and technology.
So Welcome Data Labs were inside the Wellcome Trust. I think they're the second biggest philanthropy in the world after the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They focus on funding health research, life sciences. And I started with them in 2013, first as head of digital, building up their digital team. And then I changed and expanded the portfolio into data. I basically realized that Wellcome, for all its size, wasn't at the forefront as it should be of how to use data. So I started this team of data scientists, software engineers, and also uniquely social scientists embedded in that team. And it was something we did from the very beginning. We were quite early on caught on to the fact that because of my background, data and technology has this social element. So we experimented and from the very beginning had a social scientist, a sociologist in the team, working with the techs in building data products. It was a hugely exciting 5 years or so of my life because we really got the backing of the board at Wellcome to do lots of great research and development. We used some of the early large language models, what is now the buzz everywhere with ChatGPT, so much earlier versions of BERT and SciBERT we used to do things like classify scientific content automatically. So lots of fun. We had developed interesting products which are still used by the Wellcome Trust and the scientific community. And I had a really great team, which I still miss.
And Daniel, I mean, to frame a little bit more context here, of course, we have a global audience that are focus on the business of venture and technology, but not necessarily thinking hard about the use of data in philanthropy in the way that you have. Can you just expand a little bit in terms of where did that all come to be? What was the question that Wellcome Trust was looking to answer with the data sets that they were putting together? What were the challenges there, and how did your role come into play?
Sure. Well, I guess there are two angles there, and one of them will be very close to your audience. So Wellcome Trust is fundamentally investing in the science of the future. So it's funding research in the life sciences, and therefore it needs to know what it has funded already and what impact its funding has had. So the first type of data that we analyze is both funding data and publications data from the scientific enterprise. So we want to understand if we made this investment of, let's say, $1 million into this life sciences lab, what 5 years on has the lab produced in terms of research, in terms of patents, in terms of maybe pharmaceutical products that came out of it. So that first part of the job was connecting those two types of data, funding data with the data in terms of outputs of the scientific process, and understanding the impact of our investment, which I think to your VC audience will be unfamiliar. The second type of data we work with is more external. So that's the actual data used in science. So whether it's genetic and genomic data sets, data on clinical trials. So that my team didn't directly work with itself, but it worked with our funding teams to make good funding decisions. So when you fund technology externally, you need to have a tech on the funding decision-making body, basically to understand from that perspective, is the technology sustainable? Is it maintained properly? Is it secure, etc.? And that was often our role. So we both worked on data internally, but also advised our funding committees on how to make good investments in teams that were working with scientific data.
Yeah. What were sort of your key learnings there? It sounds like you're working also with some pretty disparate and dirty data sets. What were some of your learnings in working through these challenging environments?
Well, in the first case, the learning was that we as philanthropies, as foundations, don't make enough use of data, which maybe will surprise people, but very large philanthropic bodies which support cutting edge science often internally don't invest enough in technology. So when we first started our work in the Wellcome Trust, that was the issue. We collected lots of data, but we rarely analyzed it. And if we did, it was often a manual effort. Somebody would read through funding proposals and research. As you can imagine, there's a limit to scale in doing it that way. So that was the first lesson. We as funders need to do a better job of using data and technology ourselves internally, just in the way we fund external teams to do it well. And once you start changing that, so once you build the internal data pipelines to analyze this type of data, suddenly you notice interesting things. You notice where there are gaps in your investments, so where maybe in the scientific environment we have underinvested. Or you notice the opposite, that in some places you are duplicative. So you invest in many tools or products which are very similar, and actually you should have encouraged those teams to work together and collaborate. So data begins to show you those kind of trends and patterns. You also begin to understand the wider environment better. And one of the things I'm keen on is to encourage philanthropies to collaborate together. Because if within a philanthropy, data analysis is often poor, between them, it's almost non-existent. So philanthropies don't do enough to collaborate together. And if it's the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, Rockefeller Foundation, whichever big philanthropy you take, they have a huge impact on the world through their support of science, and they can and should collaborate more closely to make sure that the whole scientific enterprise is better coordinated.
Yeah, and that has, in essence, become a great segue into the work that you're doing right now, right? Which is a collaboration between Rockefeller and MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeking to achieve here in DataDotOrg.
Yeah, absolutely. So DataDotOrg is a nonprofit organization, and we were set up by Rockefeller and MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, as you mentioned, about 3.5 years ago. So we were relatively young as an organization. We were set up with that very explicit purpose of trying to build the field of data for social impact. So encourage social impact organizations, widely defined from nonprofits and charities and NGOs to academic teams to even social enterprises. Encourage all of those organizations to use data better to meet their missions, to narrow the gap between what the private sector is able to do with data and what the social impact sector is doing with data. And unfortunately, that gap is growing. So that was our mission, trying to narrow the gap, trying to build up the field, build up the capacity of the field. The way we did it, though, is directly linked to your question. we do a lot of coordination between philanthropies. So think of us as an external tech partner to a philanthropy. So we work with the biggest philanthropists in the world to help them make better decisions, to help them coordinate better in terms of data and technology, to often encourage joint funding of efforts. So for example, instead of a given philanthropy funding one tool and another philanthropy funding a similar tool, which compete with each other and kind of fragment the marketplace in science, instead try to encourage joint funding in one effort to reduce fragmentation and increase kind of coordination in the field. So that's where we work. That's a lot of our effort. To give you a few examples maybe to illustrate. So one of the big projects we support is called Epiverse. So we work with the World Health Organization, with many top academic teams across the world. For example, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the UK, MIC unit in the Gambia in West Africa, and to Great Columbia Universities, Javeriana and Los Andes. We work with all of those partners to build open source, free to use tools, data tools for epidemiologists to be able to model the next epidemic, the next pandemic, something all of us, unfortunately, to our cost, have learned the importance of recently. So we work with WHO to encourage the creation of those tools, to make sure that governments around the world have free-to-use, trustworthy, open-source software for this important work. So that's the kind of project. And in that project, we've collaborated with a number of foundations. So brought together a consortium of funders, the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, IDSC, Sloan, etc.
The Epiverse was definitely on my radar here, and something that I did want to talk a little bit about the pandemic. And we were just actually talking a little bit about China early in the but does the decoupling of the world, the fragmentation of the world demonstrated in the pandemic, right? Where we thought it was an opportunity for the countries to work together, and yet the nation states took a very nationalistic approach. Does this worry you at all? How did this impact your work with the Epiverse? Is the Epiverse truly the solution? So many questions, but that's the gist of it.
So yes, it does worry me. I think in the pandemic, we saw both the best and the worst of humankind, as you often see in crises. On one side, we saw huge collaboration between scientists. The fact that we had vaccines so quickly in the process is a great testament to great collaborative work that's been done, even before the pandemic, in advance of it, but certainly during, by many, many great scientists around the world, and including data scientists, including technologists, including policymakers. So it was a broad array of experts. On the other hand, as you said, data nationalism, vaccine nationalism, all of those things really came up. And unfortunately, some countries didn't share data in the way that they should have. Many countries, particularly in the Global North, didn't share vaccines in the way they should have with other countries that needed them. So we saw both sides of that coin. So that does concern me. The question is what we do about it. Partly it's human nature. So how do we put in place mechanisms to encourage the better side of the human nature to come out the next time we are unfortunate enough to have another pandemic or another epidemic, or indeed another crisis of a different kind? Epiverse is an attempt to help do this. It's an attempt to say, let's not wait until the next crisis. We've learned from the last one some painful lessons. Let's try to put in place the mechanisms, the infrastructure now in advance of the next crisis. So one of the things we learned in the pandemic was that modeling teams across the world often had to quickly hack together some code to do the analysis. Kind of under pressure, they often basically had to make do. Now, having learned that lesson and knowing how important the trustworthiness of data, the replicability of analysis was the beginning of the idea of Epiverse. Let's try instead to build standardized tools that are available to everyone. So everyone around the world can use open free tools that they can trust, and therefore the results of the analysis in them can be comparable easily across them, easily replicatable. So it was an attempt to solve for some of those problems we identified. Another project within Epiverse, which tries to solve for another problem, which is the need for easy data access, is to try to encourage organizations and companies, including private corporations, to share in a secure and privacy-sensitive way data sets for scientific analysis. So, for example, we're working closely with a number of private corporations to share financial transaction data in an anonymized way, in a privacy-sensitive way, because that data is helpful to supplement health data sets and tells you a lot about the movements of populations, the purchase patterns around things, around different geographies, which actually add interesting extra data to the modelers when they want to understand what's happening during a pandemic. For example, if you understand in a particular geography, there is an uptick in economic activity, you can assume from that maybe a week or two later, there might be an upsurge in infections because more people in restaurants or more people meeting each other often, unfortunately, leads to greater infection rates. So looking at financial transaction data, which shows that spike in payments in a particular geography, can tell you something of what might happen in the health space a couple of weeks later. So that's another example of where we're trying to unlock new data sets and get people to share them, obviously in a way that protects privacy.
Absolutely fascinating. You mentioned this top of the conversation earlier, that the gap between the private and the public is getting wider, unfortunately. Can you expand a little bit about that and how that has impacted your work?
Yes, that is unfortunately still true. The investment just isn't comparable. So in the private sector, companies early on caught on to the importance of data, invested in analytics, technologies, infrastructure, invested in talent in a way that the social impact sector just couldn't follow. They don't have the financial resources to compete for the best data scientists. They can't attract them in terms of the salaries. And if they are lucky enough to attract them, they often can't retain them because the lure of the higher salaries is often too great. Similarly, investment in infrastructure internally is often way behind what the private sector can do. So all of that together means that often the ability of social impact organizations, particularly the small to medium-sized ones, they're falling behind more and more. So one of the things we're trying to do is, how can we build a set of digital public goods where those organizations can have access to that technology for free or at a low price point in order to be able to get good analytics and use their data, improve their data maturity, improve the way they can make data-informed decisions internally. Another thing we're trying to do is work with universities across the world to increase the supply of data talent to the social impact sector. So talent is one of the key kind of areas of disparity in private sector and social impact sector. So we have a very ambitious goal over the next 10 years to train 1 million purpose-driven data practitioners of all kinds, from data scientists to data engineers to analysts, particularly in low and middle-income countries around the world. So we have great partnerships with universities in India, for example. In Africa, we are working to design the same kind of partnerships in Latin America and Southeast Asia. So through those partnerships, we seek to train a whole new generation of young people who have a more interdisciplinary skill set. So they have the technical skills in Python and R that they need to do the analysis and create the data models, but they also have skills in a particular domain, for example, climate or health, because part of the lacking, if you like, is an inability to ask the right question. And for that, you need to have enough domain expertise. So it's not easy to translate. If you are a data person from, let's say, the retail world, you cannot immediately work on climate data. You need to have an extra set of skills to ask the right questions. So we're trying to train those skills in at the beginning with young people. And the final thing we're trying to add is an understanding of how the social sciences work here. So a lot of the work in social impact is often done with vulnerable communities. So in our modules that we teach in our data science courses, we often have modules on how to work with vulnerable communities, how to build trust, how to create more ethical, more responsible products with data. And that comes from the social sciences, from the humanities. So more interdisciplinary, more rounded individuals are being trained through these courses.
I saw this note as well with your ambitious goal there of 1 million trained. And I understand that Microsoft is backing a lot of that. Talk to us a little bit. I mean, I was just curious in terms of the role of DataDotOrg as a consortium, as someone who also leads a consortium in venture, slightly different. But what role do you play? Are you actually on the ground executing on these different projects, or are you championing a few and then outsourcing the rest? How does that work? And where do you see your priority as DataDotOrg?
So we do a lot of work through partners. Our work fundamentally can be broken down in the following way. So we start off by trying to analyze where the gaps are. So where in the social impact space, where is either there's a lacking of infrastructure or there's a lacking of talent. Once we've analyzed that, then often we build a consortium of funders, philanthropies, to support the effort to fill those gaps. Then we find partners on the ground that can help us. We have this philosophy of localism. We want to make sure that any data tools, any technologies we build are built on the ground by the people, by the communities that will use those tools. So we are really against the model of kind of helicoptering in solutions from San Francisco, London, down to Lagos, Nigeria, or Bogota, Colombia. No, we build those solutions on the ground. That means that they are tested with the communities. That means they are effective in terms of the local infrastructure and embed local kind of cultural preferences in how things are made. So throughout the world, we have great on-the-ground partners who are actually building the software, the tools, the infrastructure, or training and people. And we support them through funding, but we also support them through kind of coordination services. So we, for example, help teams to learn from each other. So if one team, let's say in a university in India, Ashoka University is one of our partners, for example, produces a great bit of educational content for a master's course in data science. That content can be open sourced and be made available to other partners in Africa, in Latin America, and reused. And vice versa, if we have a team in Latin America, in Havana, who is creating great training material for field epidemiologists in Spanish, can we translate that content and again make it available back in India? So there's kind of circulation and exchange of goods, of resources between them. So that's another role that we take. We do the funding, we also do that kind of coordination support.
Got it. So I guess the question to you is, when you think about, and you joined data.org, was it 2021, I believe?
That's right at the beginning in January.
Right at the beginning, and when the pandemic and the effects of it was on full volume here. When you think about your impact and your legacy through data.org, what is success? What are you aiming for?
So what I would love to see in 10 years' time, let's say, is a world which has a great whole new generation of young data scientists, data analysts, data engineers who are working on social impact causes. I think this is hugely important, and this should be the focus of all of us, from universities to tech companies to philanthropies to government. The problems that we face as a world together, from the climate crisis to pandemics, are huge problems, complex, systemic, interconnected. What we need to help solve them are tools which also scale. And data science and AI are those kind of tools that scale, but only if we build them in a responsible way and only if we build them with the communities affected as co-design. That's why it's so important for us to invest in people around the world who are creating those tools on the ground in local communities. So my one hope, if I don't do anything else, is that 10 years' time, we can point to this whole new generation of purpose-driven data practitioners who work to create great software, great data science analysis around the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and helping us solve the problems we face.
Yeah. So talking about young talent and the next generation, I was interestingly in preparation for this chat with you, tuning into Sam Altman. And he was talking about how he, as a person, as a leader, is always looking for the way to extrapolate exponential growth. And, that is literally ChatGPT and how it will be disruptive. In your opinion, you've done the work over the last couple of years, last decade or so, thinking about the future, thinking about impact. Where do you think these exponential areas of growth will be?
So there's no doubt, speaking of Sam and ChatGPT, there's no doubt that generative AI, large language models, of which ChatGPT is perhaps the most famous example, are going to transform things. There are kind of three broad camps about this. There are people who say it's all hype, it doesn't work. There are people who say it is the savior of everything. I'm kind of in the third camp, which is it is powerful, it's real, it has a real effect, but only for certain uses. So basically, we need to work out what to apply these technologies for and also what not to apply them for. So for me, generative AI is one of the big transformative technologies, and a lot of nonprofits in our network are already starting to think of how to apply them, which is why you mentioned Microsoft earlier, which is why we partnered up with Microsoft to offer this challenge on getting great new ideas for how to train social impact organizations in the responsible use of generative AI, like ChatGPT.
Yeah, and what would that be? I mean, just to, I guess, dig a little bit further, because you're thinking about this every day and we're not, right? In terms of social impact, in terms of applying these sort of technologies to truly scale impact to vulnerable communities, what does the use case look like?
So first of all, let's start by what ChatGPT and large language models are. We need to ground it in that. They fundamentally are massive ways of doing text prediction. So they're able to mimic human speech in a way which is very convincing, for lack of a better word. That is not the same as them doing any kind of reasoning. So that differentiation is very important to everything I'm going to explain. You need to differentiate how they simulate speech versus how they reason. So any application where you are simulating speech, for example, you're creating new text for a memo that is being drafted or an email or a document, that's a great application of ChatGPT. So as long as you are able to verify the output at the end, they can be a great co-pilot, and they can save nonprofits and social organizations a lot of time, a lot of cost by helping kind of remove repetitive tasks. So instead of drafting documents, you can just quickly check the output. So that's a great use case and will save a lot of time. Where I think there's a danger and we should avoid using them is they're not designed for search. They're not search engines. They're not designed for reasoning. Often that's where hallucination, so-called, happens, where you're asking them questions and when they don't have the right answer in their huge training data sets, they make up the answers. That is dangerous, I think, because often if users are not aware that these models are doing it, then they can be misled and have incorrect information. It leads to the rise of misinformation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think using them for language generation, great. Using them for any kind of reasoning tasks, not great. That's not what they're designed for.
If I may interrupt you here, because we were at the Inclusive Growth Summit, right, which really had me thinking about things in a different way. We've been so excited with ChatGPT, looking at it as a horizontal application. But the worry that was being said by a lot of the panelists and speakers at the summit was the fact that, for vulnerable communities, the fact that they'll be even further behind through the digital divide. And the fact that, as you said, that the use case where it matters is not really being seen through the lens of impact. How do you square 2 and 2 in this way?
So for vulnerable communities, there are a number of risks embedded in generative AI technologies. One I mentioned, which is using them for the things that they want to design to be used for. And education and training can help reduce that risk. But there are also other risks. For example, many of the large language models are trained on data sets which are not representative. They have certain inherent biases in them. For example, when ChatGPT was originally trained, it looked at Wikipedia, it looked at Reddit, and a number of other sources for its training data. Now, those 4 online do not have all viewpoints equally represented in them. So if you are in a minority already minoritized and disenfranchised in our societies, then you have a double risk of these tools using these large language models, bringing that bias you experience every day of your life and increasing it, because suddenly the written documents that are produced by these technologies, you're encoding gendered language or racist language in a way that often may be very subtle and not apparent, but it's there. That causes additional harm to disenfranchised communities. So what do we do about those kind of issues? We need to fundamentally look at what is the data on which these generative AI models are trained and make sure the data is high quality and make sure that you can actually vet where the data comes from. There's a big move at the moment, particularly in low and middle income countries, to democratize the use of large language models. That means create large language models in languages other than English, on content other than content from US websites, in order that local languages and local culture also have their own ability to use this powerful technology. So those are examples of kind of bottom-up, ground-up movements to try and correct for these kind of issues.
Yeah. And I guess the other issue, you were talking a lot about talent, right? Sure, upskilling is a solution, but what about countries where, jobs to begin with are difficult to come by? And that's the first point of what needs to be done here.
Well, actually, that's both a problem and an opportunity. So, for example, at the beginning of this year was in Nigeria, in Lagos, and we went to see a number of innovation labs in the city. And I was so impressed by the amount of young entrepreneurs, young people building startups, building new technologies and tools, applications. So the talent is there. Often it's that they need opportunity. They need opportunity to build their businesses or their nonprofit organizations, either private sector or nonprofits, and be able to compete on an equal footing with global North organizations, global North companies. Often we have this mentality of charity, which is seen as giving money to those in need. as opposed to what I think is a much stronger way is working with those countries who need help to build their own ecosystems, their own economies, to build up their own young people so they can help themselves. We need to change that perspective. If we create a dependency where all we do is come in and give funding, charitable funding, even though we're trying to do good, often we inadvertently cause problems. For example, we might inadvertently crowd out young entrepreneurs in Lagos who cannot compete with salaries given by global philanthropies or global charities. So let's be careful, I think, as a world, and let's double down on working from this perspective of localism. What is needed on the ground in whichever country in the world to build their own ecosystem, their own economy, their own startups, Googles, Facebooks of the future. There is no reason why those future organizations cannot be created and run in Lagos or Nairobi or Bogota.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to end here with an interesting question that I've been wanting to ask you because you're the data guy, right? You hold the crystal ball in some way. You're seeing the trends. And one of my recent conversations was with a good friend of mine who wrote the book, The Gray Rhino, Michelle Walker. And she talks about the pandemic, even Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who coined the term black swan theory, actually said that the pandemic was not actually a black swan. It was the fact that we as humans were in denial of a lot of the signs. So what's the next gray rhino, obvious risk that we should see coming as a society that you're seeing from the data on the ground here?
So I listened to that podcast. It was a great interview, by the way. I think the next big crisis is the most obvious one that's staring all of us in the face. It's the climate crisis and the effect it's going to have. And ironically, we all talk about it a lot, and yet we all somehow think of it in the abstract terms. But it's here, it's transforming our world now, and it'll transform every part of our world. It'll cause huge migratory pressures as people move from areas which through climate change can no longer support agriculture. It has the risk of causing conflicts inside countries, between countries. It has the risk of causing huge health challenges. We talked about pandemics. Pandemics are just minor outriders of the climate crisis because as temperatures change, the areas where, for example, mosquito-borne diseases can affect you suddenly change and increase. So climate crisis is the gray rhino of all rhinos, to use that language. And we're not doing enough about it. We're not doing enough about it. We talk about it a lot, but where is the action? So I think data science can help us. It's not the golden bullet, but it can certainly help, first of all, give us good baseline metrics. What's happening, for example, in terms of heat waves around the world? What's happening in terms of air pollution around the world? We often don't have good data about these things. And we certainly don't have good data sets which are combining different types of data together. For example, climate data with health data or socioeconomic data. Those things are interlinked, but we don't link the data. So we cannot see the patterns across domains very well. And that's one of the things I think we all need to improve.
Yeah. And if there was a big investor, which we sometimes have, tuning in that happens to be able to fund your big idea to solve this climate change issue, what would that pitch be?
I would say fund the non-sexy, boring infrastructure that allows you to interconnect data sets in a secure, privacy-preserving ways and allow that connectivity between domains so you can begin to cross-search, cross-analyze climate, health, socioeconomic data sets together.
Love that. Well, a lot more to unpack, but we're time limited here. And you're in beautiful Berlin, so I don't want to hold you back on a Friday evening. But we'll move to billion-dollar questions. So quick questions. All right, Daniel?
Let's do it.
Fire away. If you weren't doing your job right now, what would you be doing?
A novelist.
Novelist. Okay, I'll have to ask, what would your novel focus on?
Well, I love reading history and history fiction, so I guess something in that space.
Love it. What emotion do you struggle with the most and why?
I guess awkwardness or embarrassment. I'm not sure how to phrase it. I'm now being awkward and embarrassed about that. So
I love it. Of course, I would ask this question to a data guy, right? I did it on purpose. A moment you felt like giving up.
Oh, it'll probably be something in my childhood, something to do with a physical task of some sort. I've never been very good at building things or fixing things. It'll be something like that.
Okay. What would you tell your younger self on that note?
Keep going. Relax about it. It's fine.
What's your biggest insecurity still?
Insecurity. I don't know. I'm pretty grounded as a guy. I guess it's about communication. Like sometimes I'm aware being a scientist, a data person, I can be long-winded. And my comms team tells me all the time, keep it short, keep it to the point. I get my bullet points, but you can't beat a scientist out of me.
What's an opinion that you have that most people don't agree with?
Ooh, now that's a interesting one. Well, one thing I am not a great fan of is social media and some of the effects it's having, particularly on young people. But I'm not sure that's any more an unpopular opinion, because I think society has begun to wake up to some of those effects. But I'll go with that one.
Okay. Well, this is a good one because we talked about them over dinner. What are 3 values that you want your kids to espouse as they grow up?
I would love my kids to be confident, but empathetic. And I want them to be brave in trying things, not being afraid of failure.
And finally, this is a $1 billion question from a previous guest. He's one of Finland's most impactful entrepreneur that really kickstarted a lot of what was the gaming industry and social media, interestingly, in a good way, hopefully. What's an outlier crazy bet that anyone tuning in can take today?
I would say, going to our earlier part of the conversation, I would invest in young people in the areas of the world which are currently not invested in. So go to Lagos, go to Nairobi, go to Bogota, go to Hanoi, invest in young people and young entrepreneurs there.
I love that. Well, on that note, thank you for investing your time in this podcast, because it is really, truly for the next generation to learn from great icons like you that are building our future. And Danil, so grateful for everything that you're doing and in really improving the state of our world.
Thanks so much, Tara. Thanks for having me.
And thanks so much for tuning in this week. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow our socials on Sarah Chen Global to get the latest on the show. It would really help me out too if you enjoyed this to rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts and share your favorite episodes with a friend. I'm Sarah Chen-Spellings, and you've been listening to $1 Billion Moves.